Hi everybody, here we go with chapter 1 of our textbook, Communication Disorders. This is going to be part 1 of chapter 1. So chances are someone you know has a communication disorder. So while you're listening to this and reading about this, I want you to think about how would your life differ if you had a communication disorder. And it's also possible, like I do, that you have a communication disorder yourself. How would your life change if you did not have the disorder, right? So if you don't stutter, if you don't have a speech sound disorder, if you don't have a hearing impairment, if you don't have lots of different things, what would it be like to have one of those things? And if you do, what would your life be like if it suddenly went away? Would it change things in any way? I know that I've grown a lot from having my own sort of issues with my stuttering, and it's made me a better person in lots of ways. So would I have missed out on that if I didn't have a communication disorder to begin with? All right, so we're going to jump right in here. Communication. Communication is the transmission of thoughts or feelings from the mind of a speaker to the mind of a listener, and it's all means by which information is transmitted between a sender and a receiver. So we're going to talk about this in a second. You've got to have both a sender and a receiver for communication to occur. There are three main purposes of communication. One is to request something, another is to reject something or someone, and then the last one is kind of everything else, is to comment on things around you or life in general. And like we said, we've got to have two communication players. There's got to be a sender and there's got to be a receiver. We'll be talking a little bit, or a lot maybe, of this chapter about what is language, what is speech, what is communication. When I'm talking to myself in the morning, and I tend to do that, about what I have to do during the day and getting ready for my day, right? I'm talking to myself. I'm using language, I'm using speech, but there's no communication going on because it's only me. There's a sender, but there's no receiver involved. So you can have speech and language without having communication, and you can have communication without having speech and language, and we'll talk about that as well. All right, there are four main communication processes. There's formulation, transmission, reception, and comprehension. So formulation is the organization of one's thoughts or ideas, right? So you take that idea in your head, you then put that idea into words, put the words into sentences, and then you transmit it. You convey the ideas to another. So you put that idea into speech, into sign language, into some kind of gesture, into writing, in order to convey and transmit that idea to the other person. There's then reception, where the person receives that information. So again, there has to be the second person there, and that second person now has to then receive the information. Now, just because they've received the information doesn't necessarily mean that they understand and can organize that message. So this is comprehension, right? So if someone talks to me in Chinese or in Russian, I've received the message, but I can't comprehend it. So, it takes the reception and the comprehension of the listener in order for communication to take place. So human communication is social interaction among people. And the purpose of communication is that it impacts other people in some way, right? Even if it's just somebody learns something about you, or that, whatever that is, whether you're in a store saying hello, or you're telling something really important to somebody, or asking for something, it has some small impact on somebody else. And so we're going to be talking this chapter about whether or not animals communicate, whether animals have language. So, and that, the language part is pretty controversial still, I think. but we know that animals communicate, right? When I wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning to help get kids ready for school, right, my cat is right there immediately telling me that she has not been fed since 1975 and is starving to death, even though that's not true, right? So she gets immediately fed, and she, throughout the day, if we're home, will tell us she has not been fed, and she'll also tell us that she wants to go outside. She'll tell us whether she's happy by purring, right? And our dogs will do the same thing, right? They communicate with us, they communicate with other dogs. So animals have tons of communication that's going on all the time. But we're going to talk later about, does that mean they have language? So successful communication requires the things that we've talked about plus one other. So it requires a sender, it requires a shared symbolic system, right? So again, if I'm speaking in English, the other person has to understand English. If I'm using sign language, the other person has to understand sign language. So that shared symbolic system is really important. There's got to be a receiver, but there's also got to be feedback, so that, you know, often the sender needs to know that the receiver heard what they want to say or what they said, or they'll say it again, right? And kids will do this all the time. So, Dad, I'm hungry. Dad, can I get something to eat? Dad, can we have lunch? Dad, can we do this? Dad. And it's like, whoa, I did hear you. You know, I haven't had a chance to say anything yet, but I heard you the first time. You didn't have to tell me 100 times, because they want that feedback. They need that feedback to know that they've communicated, or they'll do it again. So feedback that, yes, I acknowledge what you said, is also a part of successful communication. So, and there's more here. Information provided from the receiver to the sender, so that linguistic feedback of, yes, I heard you, yes, that sounds good, yes, let's do that, no, I don't think we should do that, right? But some kind of feedback. There's also non-linguistic or extra-linguistic feedback, so anything not involving language. So it could be a nod of the head, it could be like, you're right, I've heard you and I'm thinking about what you said. Could be non-linguistic or extra-linguistic feedback. And then there's also paralinguistic feedback, which has to do with your tone of how you're giving the feedback. So there's a big difference between, you know, if I ask you, does this make sense? And you say yes, right? You've given me linguistic feedback that, yes, that makes sense. If I ask you if this makes sense and you say yes, you've kind of told me you don't understand what I've said, right? Linguistically, you told me yes, but paralinguistically, I know that you really don't understand what I'm talking about. All right, so now language, speech, and hearing. Your textbook talks about these as the essential ingredients of human communication, right? But that's not really true. Somebody who doesn't have hearing and is deaf would say, I don't have speech or hearing, but I communicate really well with sign language. So, you know, take that with a grain of salt with what your book's talking about. But because you can certainly have good communication without speech and hearing. It's used for the formulation, transmission, reception, and comprehension of information. Okay. So language. Language is the cognitive process by which we formulate ideas and thoughts. It's a rule-based system of symbols and codes used to communicate. So you don't think about that, but you know, every part of language is rule-based, right? Whether it's what the letters look like on the screen, whether it is, you know, which words can go before, right? If you have the word the, there then has to be a noun after that. So everything we do, everything we say using language is rule-based, even though we don't think about that, and we'll talk more about that. And language is a form of social behavior shaped and maintained by a verbal community, right? So we all just kind of decide on what the words are that we can use, and how we talk is going to be shaped by, the community that you're in. If you grew up in North Carolina, you're going to be using different words, and you're going to be saying words differently than if you grew up in Brooklyn, right? It's going to be a different, even though you both speak English, your social community is going to shape how you talk and the words that you use. And again, this can be for oral or non-oral language, right? Non-oral language being sign language, being writing, things like that. Language is a socially shared code that uses a conventional system of arbitrary symbols to represent ideas about the world that are meaningful to self and others. So, right, that idea of arbitrary symbols, right? Number one, we've just chosen the alphabet, A, B, C, D, right? We just made that up. And then, why do we call a chair a chair? Why do we call a table, right? We've just made these things up, and at some point somebody decided that, yeah, that sounds good, right? And maybe, in English, maybe those words are based on Latin or are based on German or something else, but at some point somebody just made that up, and somebody else said, yeah, that sounds good. So we've just decided to do this, even though it's completely arbitrary about the words and the symbols that we're using. Language, there are lots of different pieces of language, lots of different ways that we can break language down. One way that we can break language down is by talking about it as far as expressive language and receptive language. Expressive language is language that is produced, whether it's spoken, signed, or written. And then there's receptive language, which is language that's understood or comprehended. You do that by listening, by comprehending, by reading, is going to be receptive language. All right. Now, these ideas come from Noam Chomsky, who was a linguist, started in the 1950s. He's still alive today, speaking, although he often speaks on different things now, but he was a big linguist and had a big impact on what we know about and think about language. First, language is universal. So every culture of humans in the world uses language. They're all different languages, but every culture has a language. Chomsky also argued that language is species specific. So he believed and he wrote that only humans use language, and that animals do not use language, and that part of that comes in what we're going to talk about in these next three things, so that even though animals can communicate with each other really well, that they don't use language. So one reason for that is that language is decontextualized. And this is the idea that we don't have to have the context in front of us in order to use language. So you can tell me what you did over winter break, right? I can ask you how your break was, and you could say, oh, it was great. I did this and this and this and blah, 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 blah. I can ask you, what do you want to do in 5 years? And you can tell me all of that things, right? Chomsky would argue that an animal can't do that. That when my cat tells me that she's hungry, right, she's hungry right now. When my cat tells me she wants to go outside, she wants to go outside right now, right? And that she'd have a really hard time, and in fact probably couldn't tell me, even if we both spoke cat, right? Would she be able to tell me what she did last summer? Would she be able to tell me what her hopes and dreams as a cat are? Right? Probably not. So the idea that we can talk about past, future, and right now is species specific, that idea that it's decontextualized. Next, the idea is that it's productive, so that children can learn language, but then they can also produce novel utterances that they've never heard before. and I'll try to think of an example. My 6-year-old was watching my wife do yoga the other day, and he said, she was watching a YouTube video, and he said, "Is she a professional yoga teacher?" And my wife said, "Yes." And he said, "That's good, because I wouldn't want you to do fake yoga." Now, no one has ever said that to him, right? He's never heard those words put together before, right? He produced that on his own. That was his own idea, so that humans very quickly can produce their own novel sentences and ideas that they've never heard before. And again, Chomsky would argue that you can teach animals, you can teach gorillas to use sign language, but can they use it? Can they produce novel signs? Can they come up with their own ideas and own ways of using language? He would argue no, but maybe that's not true. The last idea is that it's learned really quickly by young children. So at the first birthday, children are speaking one word. By the second birthday, children have at least 50 words that they're saying, and then we have a huge explosion. So that within 3 or 4 years, children are talking like adults. They're using adult-like language when they've only been hearing it for 3 or 4 years. And that Chomsky couldn't sort of comprehend the idea that animals could use a complicated form like language and do it in their lifetimes. That would just be too much. That animals can communicate. They can tell us what they need. They can tell us if they're scared, if they're happy, right? But that it's not this complicated system that's learned rapidly. It's just they're able to communicate their feelings and their needs right now, but that they're not able to have a complicated language like humans are. So Chomsky was a linguist. Linguistics is the study of language, its structure, and its rules. And again, the community arbitrarily selects the codes or symbols. So a linguist studies how and why the community has done this. Why do we just make up these rules and these codes and these symbols that we have for language? Now, there are different domains of language. So there are a couple ways we can talk about domains. The first way is to break it down into 3 areas, and then we're going to break it down even further. But the first is to look at content. So content refers to meaning. Often when we're talking about content, we're going to be talking about vocabulary. Form refers to the organization and structure of the language. And then use is going to refer to how the language is actually used. And we're going to break this down even more and talk about this. So there are 3 ways that we can talk about form. So you can break language, probably the topic of this should probably be language. You can break language down into 5 specific areas, 3 of which are about form: phonology, morphology, and syntax. 1 is about content, semantics, and 1 is about pragmatics. So let's talk about these 5 areas. Phonology is the study of speech sounds and sound patterns. Phonology examines the rules and processes that govern the patterns of sounds and sound systems, right? So again, we've got rules with phonology, and we've got processes. So if you come up with a new word, and that new word begins with LRJ, that violates the rules, right? We don't make those sounds at the beginning of words together, right? We got to have vowels in there. We can't have L, R, and J together. So that violates the rules of phonology. That's not the kind of speech sounds we make, right? So, and we'll talk more when we talk about phonemes and what a phoneme is, about being units of sounds. So phonology is the study of speech sounds and sound patterns. And again, so a phoneme is the smallest unit of sound. So f is a sound, o is a sound, e, right? Those are all distinct units of sounds. And speech is basically the production of meaningful phonemes. So the smallest unit of sound used in speech is going to be a phoneme. So f, o, e, are all separate phonemes. Morphology is the study of structures. A morpheme is the smallest meaningful unit of language. So a phoneme is the smallest unit of speech sound. The morpheme is the smallest meaningful unit of language. Words contain at least one morpheme. You can have a base morpheme, a prefix, a suffix, a free, and a bound morpheme. So a base morpheme is something that makes sense all by itself. So the base morpheme is going to be small, right? That word by itself is, has meaning by itself, and it's there. A prefix is a morpheme that goes in front of a word. So if we talk about restructure, right, that re goes in front of the word. The re only has meaning when it's connected to a base or a free morpheme. A suffix goes at the end, right? So if we talk about cat, cat is a base morpheme. But if we're talking about more than one cat, we're talking about cats. Adding that s on the end is a suffix. So suffix is morphemes that go after the base morpheme. A free morpheme is also a base morpheme. A free morpheme is a morpheme that can exist on its own. So the word small, the word mean, the word unit, of, language, these are all morphemes that can exist on their own and have meaning. A bound morpheme only has meaning when it's attached to something else. So plural s is a bound morpheme. It means more than one, but you can't have it all by itself or it doesn't mean anything. Ing is also a bound morpheme, right? It's going to be a suffix. So a prefix and a suffix are all going to be a bound morpheme because they don't have meaning by themselves. They have to be attached to another morpheme. Syntax. Syntax is the arrangement of words to form meaningful sentences. Lots of people think about this as grammar. This is where a lot of the rules of language take place. We're talking about word order. And Chomsky said that grammar is innate, that he believed that we had a part of our brain that was able to give us the structure of language, to provide word order, and to allow us to put words in the proper order, nouns, verbs, adjectives, and that all of that made sense. And that without syntax, we don't have anything, because syntax is the building block of language. Semantics. So now we're getting into meaning. Semantics is the study of meaning, the referent theory of meaning, so it's a person, place, or thing. Now, right, Chomsky says that grammar, syntax is sort of the foundation of language, but he also understood that meaning is what drives why we talk, right? So he used the sentence, colorless green ideas sleep furiously. That is a grammatically correct sentence, but it has no meaning. So even though syntax was the foundation of language, he believed that we talk because of semantics, because if there's no meaning, there's no reason to use language if we don't have meaning. Lastly, we've got pragmatics. Pragmatics is the study of the rules that govern the use of language, language function, and the idea of a speech act that words influence listeners, saying is doing. And if you think about it, right, how we use language is really rule-based, and we're almost like robots in a way, right? If I come into a room and I see you, I'm going to say hello, and then you're going to say hello, and then you might say, how are you? And I'll say, I'm good, how are you? And you'll say, oh, I'm doing well. And then maybe you'll ask me a question, or maybe you'll tell me something about your day, but it's very, how we use language is often very programmed, right? So pragmatics is about the study of the rules that govern how we use that language. All right, so separate from language, we have speech. Speech is a neuromuscular process that allows us to express language vocally. The precise activation of muscles in the respiration, phonation, and articulation systems to transmit language. So we're going to talk about respiration, phonation, and articulation, and how we have to put those all together to make speech. So respiration is about breathing. Speech begins at exhalation. So we inhale and then we start talking when we exhale. An inability to produce or maintain a strong breath stream can result in disordered speech. And maybe strong is the wrong word, right? Because it doesn't have to be strong, but it has to be enough breath there that we're able to use our sentences and make long sentences and be able to speak easily. Voicing. Voice quality is very important. A breathy, hoarse, broken, or nasal voice can impact communication and comfort of the speaker, right? So, voicing. So, right, so some of our sounds are voiced, some are unvoiced, right? The sound S is not voiced. The sound Z is voiced. We do the exact same thing with our breath and with our place of articulation for S and Z. S is not voiced, Z is voiced. Loudness or intensity and pitch are also important, right? If you're speaking too loudly or too quietly, that's going to impact your speech intelligibility. And then your pitch are also important, right? You don't want to be too monotone, speaking exactly the same way all the time, and you can't be high pitch, low pitch, high pitch, low pitch all the time, or that's going to make your speech sound hard to understand. Articulation. Articulation is the movement of the speech mechanism to produce the sounds of speech. So structures such as the soft palate, the tongue, the lips create the sounds of speech, right? So for the sound I'm going to use my lips to create the I'm going to use my tongue to make the T sound, right? So articulation is using the movement of the speech mechanism to produce the sounds of speech. And it's the way that sounds are actually produced. Fluency then is putting all that together. So you've got to have respiration, you've got to have phonation, you've got to have articulation, easy, smooth, flowing, and effortless speech. Continuity and speech rate are very important. And we can have things like hesitations, interjections, repetitions, prolongations that are going to break up our easy, smooth, flowing speech, right? And people use interjections, well, like, right? They do that all the time, and we don't even pick up on it. So we can have breaks in our fluency that are totally normal, but then if we have too many, or they're not your typical disfluencies, they're going to become noticeable and maybe make it difficult to speak easily. Next, we've got to talk about hearing and audition. Hearing is the perception of sound. It's one half of speech communication, right? So that you can speak, but if no one can hear you, you don't have communication. Hearing involves the awareness of the sound, the ability to then distinguish among sounds. So the awareness of sound, I hear a sound, I know which sound it is, number 2, and then 3, the ability to process sound rapidly, right? While I'm speaking right now, I'm using tons of different sounds, tons of different phonemes. You've got to put them all together into words and understand, process what I'm actually saying. Acoustics is the study of sound. How does sound get from one place to another? Number 1, you've got to have a sound source vibration. So right now when I'm speaking, my vocal folds are vibrating. Number 2, the vibration of air particles. My vibration of my vocal folds and of my mouth is now going out into the world. If you were here with me then, you would just receive that, your ear would receive that vibration. And then lastly, there would be comprehension by the brain of what I was actually saying. And we are going to stop here for part 1, and we will pick up with part 2.